The enemy failed. God is rebuilding you. Vertical bar, powerful motivation for your comeback. My dear friend, I want you to stop everything you are doing right now and receive what I am about to pour into your spirit, because I believe with every fiber of my being that you did not find these words by accident. You did not arrive at this moment through some random and meaningless sequence of events that had nothing to do with the sovereign hand of the living God. No, the God who breathed the stars into existence, the God who calls every galaxy by name, the God who formed you in your mother's womb with deliberate and loving precision, and who has been present through every single moment of your journey from your very first breath to this exact second, that God arranged this moment. He saw where you were. He knew what you have been walking through. He understood the specific weight of the specific battle that brought you to this place. And He directed your steps here because He has something He needs to declare into the center of your life that is going to change everything about how you see what has happened to you and how you step into what is coming next. And what He wants to declare is this: the enemy failed. Every attack that was launched against your life, every strategy that was formed in the darkness against your peace and your purpose and your future, every assignment that was sent to destroy what God was building in and through you, every attempt to silence your voice and steal your joy and abort your calling and render your life less than what God declared it was always meant to be, every single one of them failed. Not partially, not mostly, completely. The enemy came against you with everything he had, and he failed. And now, in the aftermath of the battle that the enemy launched and lost, the God who was with you through every moment of the fight is doing something in your life that is so extraordinary and so comprehensive and so far beyond what the enemy could have anticipated when he launched his assault, that it stands as the ultimate confirmation of the truth that what was meant to destroy you was used by God to develop you. God is rebuilding you, not restoring you to what you were before the attack. Not simply repairing the damage and returning you to the baseline condition that existed before the enemy showed up. Rebuilding you from a deeper foundation with stronger materials into a more complete and more fully expressed version of what He always declared you were meant to be. This is your comeback, not the modest, barely made it, glad to have survived comeback of someone who weathered a storm and came out the other side somewhat diminished but still functional. The extraordinary, God-authored, enemy-confounding, testimony-producing comeback of someone whose story was specifically designed by the sovereign God of all creation to demonstrate to every person who witnesses it that what God builds cannot be permanently destroyed, that what God declares cannot be permanently denied, and that what God purposes for a life cannot be permanently prevented by any force in heaven or on earth or under the earth. Receive this word today, all of it, every declaration, every promise, every specific and targeted statement about who you are and what God is doing and where He is taking you. Receive it not with the cautious, self-protective, half-believing reception of someone who has been through enough disappointment to be careful about hope. Receive it with the open-handed, wide-hearted, full-spirited reception of someone who knows that the God who is speaking it has never once spoken a word that He did not fulfill, because He is about to demonstrate His faithfulness in your life in ways that are going to leave you overwhelmed with gratitude and breathless with worship, and absolutely certain that the same God who brought you through the battle has been using the battle all along to prepare you for the breakthrough. The enemy failed. God is rebuilding you, and your comeback is not coming. It is here. Let me begin by speaking honestly and completely about what the enemy actually attempted in your life, because before we can fully receive the declaration of his failure, we need to be clear about what he was trying to accomplish. And the truth is that what the enemy was trying to accomplish in your life was not small. It was not a minor inconvenience or a temporary setback that was always going to be easily overcome. What he was trying to accomplish was your complete and permanent destruction. The enemy does not send minor nuisances against lives that carry significant destiny. He does not invest his most sophisticated strategies and his most persistent assault against people whose calling is small and whose impact is limited and whose testimony would not matter much to the broader advance of the kingdom. He reserves his most comprehensive and his most relentless attacks for the ones whose fully activated purpose poses the greatest threat to everything he is trying to build in the world. And the fact that you have been through what you have been through, the fact that the attack was as sustained and as targeted and as multidimensional as it was, is itself one of the most powerful pieces of evidence that you carry something significant, something worth attacking. Something that the enemy recognized as a genuine threat to his purposes, even when you yourself were not fully aware of what you were carrying. Some of you have been through attacks on your health. The kind of physical assault that came without warning and that changed the landscape of your daily life in ways that made the fulfillment of the calling you carried feel impossibly distant. Diagnoses that arrived like bombshells. Chronic conditions that installed themselves as permanent fixtures of your experience and that stole your energy and your confidence and sometimes your sense of a viable future. Physical suffering that was not just physically painful, but that was spiritually disorienting, that made you wonder whether the God who declared healing was present in the suffering, or whether the suffering was evidence that the declaration was not for you. Some of you have been through attacks on your relationships, the most devastating and the most deeply personal kind of attack, because the relationships that the enemy targeted were not peripheral ones, they were the central relationships. The marriage that was the foundation of everything else in your life, the friendship that had been the constant through every season, the family connection that was supposed to be the safe place, and that became instead the source of some of the deepest wounds you have ever carried. The mentor or the leader who was supposed to protect you, and who used the access that protection required to do the opposite. The betrayal that came from the direction where you were most completely unprepared for it, because you had no reason to expect it from the... Some of you have been through attacks on your finances, the kind of financial devastation that was not just inconvenient, but that reached into the foundational structures of your life and dismantled them. The loss of the business you had built with years of faithful work and sacrificial investment. The sudden elimination of the income that everything else in your life depended on. The unexpected financial emergency that arrived at the moment when you were least equipped to absorb it, and that left you in a position of vulnerability so complete that the independence you had worked so hard to establish felt like something that might never be fully recovered. Some of you have been through attacks on your mind and your emotional well-being, the depression that settled in like a fog that would not lift regardless of how hard you prayed or how consistently you applied every spiritual and practical tool available to you. The anxiety that turned every ordinary situation into a source of dread and that made the simple act of functioning through a normal day feel like an enormous and exhausting achievement. The trauma that embedded itself in your nervous system and that continued to produce its effects long after the events that produced it had passed. The mental and emotional warfare that was waged against your sense of who you are and your confidence in the calling God placed on your life and your ability to believe that the future God declared was still available to you. Some of you have been through attacks on your purpose and your calling. The doors that were closed, not gently but slammed, at the exact moments when you were most expectant about walking through them. The opportunities that were sabotaged from within by people who appeared to be allies. The platforms that were built and then demolished. The communities that were formed and then fractured. The assignments that were launched in faith and that met with resistance so comprehensive and so specifically targeted that it could not have been explained by anything other than an organized and deliberate spiritual opposition to what you were building. I see you in each of those places. And I want to say to you with complete directness and complete compassion that what you endured was real, the attack was genuine, the damage was real, the pain was not exaggerated or spiritually immature or evidence of insufficient faith. It was the genuine, costly, deeply human experience of someone who was caught in the crosshairs of an enemy, who knew exactly what he was targeting, and who applied his most comprehensive strategy to the attempt to destroy it. But here is the declaration that changes everything about what you just read. He failed in every single one of those areas, in every single one of those attacks, in every strategy he formed, and every weapon he deployed, and every door he tried to permanently close, and every relationship he tried to permanently destroy, and every calling he tried to permanently abort. He failed, not because you were stronger than the attack, because the God who was with you through every moment of it is stronger than anything the enemy could ever send.
Slå du kan ta fans, som inte kan till förhand, till ju kan till kan.
I want to speak now about why the enemy failed, because the failure was not accidental. It was not the result of a poorly executed strategy or a miscalculation about the resilience of your character. It was the inevitable outcome of a battle that the enemy was always going to lose, because he made a fundamental and irreversible error in his assessment of what he was attacking. He thought he was attacking you. He was actually attacking the purposes of God. And the purposes of God cannot be permanently defeated, not by any force, not by any strategy, not by any assault, however comprehensive and however sustained. The purposes of God stand, always, in every generation. Through every attack, against every opposition, they stand, and every attempt to destroy them becomes in the hands of the sovereign God who turns what was meant for evil into what works for good. One more element of the preparation that makes their ultimate fulfillment more complete and more powerful, and more undeniably the work of God than it would have been if the path to fulfillment had been smooth and unobstructed. Romans 8:28 says that all things work together for good for those who love God and who are called according to his purpose. All things, not the pleasant things while the painful things are excluded, not the victories while the defeats are written off as losses. All things. The attack that was meant to destroy you, the betrayal that was meant to isolate you, the financial devastation that was meant to strip you of your capacity, the physical assault that was meant to incapacitate you, the mental and emotional warfare that was meant to render you ineffective. All of it, every bit of it, working together under the sovereign orchestration of a God who is so comprehensively in control of the circumstances of your life that he can take even the enemy's most deliberate attempts at destruction and use them as material for the most extraordinary demonstration of his faithfulness that your life has ever produced. The enemy failed because God was already at work turning the attack into advancement, because every wound the enemy inflicted became a place where God's healing power was most dramatically demonstrated, because every door the enemy closed became a redirection toward a better door that God had already prepared. Because every relationship the enemy tried to destroy either became stronger through the pressure the attack applied, or was revealed to be less than what it appeared to be, which itself was a form of divine protection. Because every financial loss the enemy orchestrated became the condition under which God could demonstrate a provision that was so clearly supernatural that no human accounting could explain it. The enemy attacked, and God used every element of the attack for his own sovereign purposes, and the result of God using the attack for his purposes is something that the enemy never intended and never anticipated and cannot undo. The result is a version of you that is deeper and stronger and more fully formed and more completely aligned with the purpose God always had in mind that the pre-attack version could ever have been. The result is a testimony that is more powerful precisely because of what it cost. A faith that is more solid precisely because of what it was tested by. A dependence on God that is more complete precisely because the attack stripped away every other thing you might have been tempted to depend on instead. The enemy failed. And in failing, he served the purposes of the God he was trying to defy. He became an unwilling instrument of the preparation that the breakthrough required. And now the God who used every element of the attack for his own purposes is using every element of the aftermath to build something in your life that is going to stand as one of the most powerful testimonies of divine faithfulness that anyone who witnesses it has ever seen. I want to speak now about what God is specifically building in the rebuilding that is happening in your life right now, because the declaration that God is rebuilding you is not a vague and general statement about things getting better. It is a specific and targeted description of a comprehensive, divine construction project that is currently underway in every dimension of your life and that is producing something that exceeds what existed before the attack in ways that only the building process the attack initiated could have made possible. The first thing God is rebuilding is your foundation, not the foundation that you built yourself in the years before the attack. Not the foundation that was partly rooted in him and partly rooted in the other things that your life was resting on before the enemy came and revealed, through the pressure of his assault, which parts of the foundation could hold the weight and which parts could not. The new foundation that God is laying in the aftermath of the attack is laid deeper and is made of more thoroughly tested materials and is established with a comprehensiveness and a permanence that the pre-attack foundation, for all its apparent solidity, never had. Because the attack revealed something essential. It revealed what your life was actually resting on, and some of what it was resting on was genuine and solid and capable of sustaining the weight of the earthquake the enemy sent. Your faith in God, your love for the people you were genuinely called to love, your commitment to the purpose God placed in you, those things held, but other things that had appeared solid turned out to be less so. The security that was too rooted in financial stability, the confidence that was too dependent on other people's affirmation, the sense of purpose that was too connected to the specific platform through which you were expressing it, rather than to the purpose itself. The relationships that were more about what they provided for your own emotional security than about genuine mutual covenant. The earthquake of the enemy's attack revealed what was solid and what was not. And God, in his rebuilding, is not reconstructing the parts that were not solid. He is laying a new foundation in those places, a foundation that is rooted more completely and more exclusively in him, that does not depend on the cooperation of external circumstances to remain intact, that is as stable in the storm as it is in the sunshine, as complete in the season of lack as it is in the season of abundance, as secure when the platforms are absent as it is when they are present. That foundation is the most important thing God is rebuilding. And when it is complete, when the new and deeper and more thoroughly tested foundation has been fully laid, everything that is built on it is going to be more stable and more enduring and more genuinely fruitful than anything that was built on the pre-attack foundation could ever have been. The second thing God is rebuilding is your identity, and this is perhaps the most significant and the most personally transformative dimension of the rebuilding that is currently underway, because for many of you the most devastating element of what the enemy attacked was not your circumstances. It was your sense of who you are, the internal narrative about your worth and your value and your place in the world and what you have to contribute and whether what you carry genuinely matters to anyone or to God. The enemy is not primarily interested in your circumstances. He is interested in your identity, because he knows that a person whose identity is genuinely rooted in what God declares about them cannot be permanently defeated by any external circumstance. Their circumstances can be disrupted, their platform can be removed, their financial security can be threatened, their health can be attacked, but if their identity is anchored in the immovable reality of who God says they are, none of those external disruptions can produce the internal collapse that the enemy is always ultimately aiming for. And so the most consistent and the most persistent element of every attack the enemy mounts against a person whose life carries significant kingdom purpose is the attack on identity, the whisper that says you are not who you thought you were. The suggestion that what happened to you is evidence that you were never as special or as called or as favored as you believed. The implication that the defeat means God has moved on, or that the promise was never really for you, or that the calling was a mistake that is now being quietly corrected by the circumstances you are navigating. Those whispers are lies, every one of them. And the God who is rebuilding you is rebuilding your identity on a foundation that is so thoroughly grounded in what he declares about you that those lies will never again have the same access to the center of your self-understanding that they had before the attack. Because here is what the rebuilding of your identity involves. It involves the progressive and comprehensive replacement of every identity-defining statement that came from any source other than God with the specific declarations that God makes about you in His Word and that He speaks over you through His Spirit. The statements that came from the people who rejected you, the messages that came from the circumstances that suggested you were less than what God declared. The internal narratives that formed through the pain of the attack and that presented themselves as honest self-assessment but were actually the enemy's voice wearing the costume of your own inner wisdom. All of those identity-defining statements are being replaced by the truth. You are chosen. Before the foundation of the world, before the attack, before the defeat, before the humiliation, before the loss, you were chosen by the God who knew everything you would go through, and who chose you anyway. Not despite what he knew was coming, but with full knowledge of it, and with the complete confidence that the person who emerged from what was coming was exactly the person he needed to fulfill the purpose he always had in mind. You are loved, completely, without condition. Without the reduction that the attack might suggest, the love of God for you is not diminished by what you have been through. It is not reduced by your season of vulnerability, or your moments of doubt, or the places where the attack found its mark and left its wound. You are loved exactly as much in the aftermath of the battle as you were before it began, and you are loved exactly as much in the season of rebuilding as you will be when the rebuilding is complete and the breakthrough is fully visible. You are purposed, still. The purpose that God placed in you before you were born is not canceled. It is not revised downward to account for the damage of the attack. It is not transferred to someone who went through less. It is still yours, still alive, still being advanced by the God who placed it in you and who has been using everything that happened to you to prepare you to fulfill it at a level of depth and authenticity and power that would not have been possible without the experience of everything you went through. That is the identity God is rebuilding into you. And when the rebuilding is complete, when the truth of who he says you are has displaced every lie the enemy planted in the attack, the confidence and the boldness and the settled sense of purpose that characterize your daily life are going to be qualitatively different from anything that existed before, because they will be rooted in something that the enemy cannot touch. The immovable, unchanging, sovereignly declared truth of who you are in God. The third thing God is rebuilding is your faith. And I want to speak about this very carefully, because I know that for many of you the statement that God is rebuilding your faith carries within it the implied acknowledgement that the faith was damaged in the attack. And that acknowledgement is uncomfortable because it touches something that feels like it should not have been vulnerable. It touches the sense that a person of genuine faith should not have had their faith shaken by what happened. That if the faith was solid, it should have remained undisturbed through the storm. But here is the truth that I want to speak into that discomfort. The faith that was genuinely tested by what the enemy sent was not weak faith, it was real faith, because you cannot test what is not real. You cannot shake what does not genuinely exist. The fact that the attack found something to push against in your faith is evidence that the faith was genuine. A performance of faith has nothing to push against. A theatrical confidence in God that was never rooted in genuine relationship with Him will dissolve at the first serious pressure without producing any of the anguished wrestling that genuine faith produces when it is tested to its limits. The faith you had before the attack was real. And real faith, genuinely tested, genuinely stretched to its limits, genuinely required to hold on in the dark, when the evidence was thin and the silence was heavy, and the natural assessment of the situation made trust the most seemingly illogical response available. Real faith that goes through that and still holds is not weakened by the test, it is deepened, it is expanded, it is made more solid at the places where the test revealed it was thinner than it needed to be, and where God then poured Himself in to strengthen what the pressure exposed. The faith God is rebuilding in you is not the faith that existed before the attack. It is something better, something more thoroughly tested, something that has been through the fire and has come out with the impurities burned away and the pure gold of genuine, costly, nothing can shake me now trust in God remaining, something that does not depend on pleasant circumstances to remain intact. Something that was built in the most difficult conditions imaginable, and that therefore can sustain itself in every condition imaginable, because it has already been tested by the worst and found sufficient. That is the faith God is building in you through the rebuilding process. A faith that has scars, a faith that knows what it feels like to hold on when holding on requires everything you have. A faith that has been to the edge of what it could sustain and has found that even at the edge the God who was being trusted did not let it fall. And a faith that is more powerful and more genuine and more authentically yours precisely because it was forged through the fire, rather than inherited as a comfortable assumption. I want to speak now about the comeback itself. about what it looks like and what it does not look like, and how to recognize it as it is happening, and how to position yourself to receive the fullness of everything God is releasing through it. The comeback that God authors is never the simple reversal of what the enemy did. It is never merely the restoration of the status quo that existed before the attack. It is always something more. Something that bears the specific marks of having been through the fire, and of having found God faithful in the fire, and of having been rebuilt on the other side of the fire into something more solid, and more fruitful, and more genuinely aligned with the fullness of what God always declared. Joseph did not come back from the pit to the same position he had before his brothers threw him in. He came back to a position that was incomparably greater. Not because God was compensating him for his suffering with an upgrade, but because the specific preparation that the pit and the slavery and the prison provided was the preparation for an assignment that exceeded what any position available to him in his father's house could have ever offered. And your comeback will not look like a simple return to what was. It will look like the advancement to what was always declared. It will look like the doors opening that could not have opened before the preparation the attack provided. It will look like the purpose that God always had in mind beginning to find its expression in ways that the pre-attack version of you was not yet equipped to sustain. It will look like the specific and particular fruitfulness that comes from a life that has been rebuilt on a deeper foundation and is now expressing itself from a place of greater depth and greater authenticity and greater power than anything that existed before the attack. The comeback looks like the doors opening, not with your pushing, not with your campaigning and your networking and your strategic positioning. The sovereign, favor-accompanied opening of doors that God is opening because the appointed time for them to open has arrived, and because the person who is going to walk through them has been prepared by everything that has happened to carry with integrity and with fruitfulness what is waiting on the other side. The comeback looks like the provision arriving from unexpected sources, through channels that human planning could not have anticipated, in measures that exceed what the current natural situation would suggest is possible. Because the God who is the source of the comeback is not limited by the natural situation. He is limited only by His own sovereign will. And His sovereign will for the people who have been through the fire and have found Him faithful in it and have come out the other side, rebuilt and ready, is the fullness of the promise He declared before the attack ever came. The comeback looks like the relationships being restored and the new relationships being formed, the ones that were damaged by the attack beginning their journey toward genuine healing. The new people arriving who are aligned with the next chapter of your purpose in ways that the relationships of the previous season may not have been. The community forming around the expression of the calling that the rebuilding has made more complete. The connections happening that bear the marks of divine orchestration, that make it clear they were not the product of human networking but of the sovereign hand of a God who arranges the paths of the people He is positioning for the next dimension of their calling. The comeback looks like the testimony forming. The story that began in the attack and that continued through the rebuilding is reaching a chapter where it can be told, where the fullness of what God was doing through what the enemy intended becomes visible, where the people who witnessed the attack and who perhaps concluded that what they were seeing was the end of your story discovered that what they were actually seeing was the setup for the most extraordinary chapter yet. And where the telling of that story does in the hearts of the people who hear it what you have always been anointed to do. It builds faith, it inspires endurance, it points people to the God who was faithful through everything. It declares with the most compelling authority available, the authority of personal experience and personal testimony, that the enemy does not have the final word. God does, always, without exception. I want to speak now about some of the specific lies that the enemy planted in you during the attack that God is now dismantling in the rebuilding process. Because the rebuilding that God is doing is not only external. It is not only the reconstruction of circumstances and relationships and opportunities and provision, it is the internal dismantling of every false belief that the attack embedded in your sense of who you are and what is possible for your life. The first lie is that you missed your moment. that the window of opportunity for the fullness of what God declared over your life opened and closed during the season of the attack, and that what you are stepping into now is a diminished version of what could have been, that the best chapter of your story is behind you and not ahead. That the comeback you are experiencing is a smaller and more modest thing than what God originally intended, because the attack delayed and disrupted and damaged what would have been the fullness of the original plan. That is a lie. God does not have diminished versions of his plans. He does not operate in a context of lost time the way human beings do. What he declares, he fulfills. And if the path to the fulfillment was longer and harder and more circuitous than it needed to be because of what the enemy sent, God does not reduce the fullness of the fulfillment to account for the detour. He redeems the detour. He uses the longer path as the preparation for a more complete arrival. He takes the time that the attack appeared to steal, and he restores it in ways that make the arrival at the destination more significant and more impactful and more genuinely fruitful than an earlier arrival on a shorter path would have been. The second lie is that you are permanently damaged. That the wounds the attack inflicted are the kind that do not fully heal, that the marks the enemy left are going to limit what you can be and do and contribute from here forward, that the person who emerged from the attack is a lesser version of the person who entered it, that the damage was too comprehensive and too deep for the rebuilding to fully repair. That is a lie. God does not rebuild with what remains after the damage. He rebuilds with what he always had in mind. The scars that remain from the wounds the attack inflicted are not evidence of permanent limitation. They are the evidence of endurance. They are the marks of someone who was in a genuine battle and who was still standing when the battle was over. And they are the credentials that give your testimony its authority, because the people who need to hear what you have to say are not going to be reached by someone who appears to have never been through anything. They are going to be reached by someone who has been through what they are going through, and who can say with the authority of personal experience that God is faithful in the fire, and that the rebuilding on the other side of it is real, and that the comeback that God authors is greater than anything the attack could permanently prevent. The third lie is that God allowed the attack because you deserved it, that what happened to you was divine punishment for something you did wrong or failed to do right, that if you had been more faithful or more prayerful or more spiritually disciplined, the attack would not have found its mark, that the suffering was your fault at some fundamental level, and that the rebuilding is therefore a grace you do not entirely deserve, rather than the expression of a love that was never diminished by what you went through. That is a lie. The attack was not punishment. The suffering was not evidence of divine disapproval. The difficulty was not the consequence of insufficient faith. The book of Job stands as the biblical testimony that genuine righteous people experience genuine devastating attacks from the enemy for reasons that have nothing to do with their having done something wrong, and everything to do with the sovereign purposes of a God who is willing to allow the temporary suffering of his most faithful ones in order to produce through them a testimony that would not have been possible without the suffering. And the God who was with Job through every moment of the attack and who restored Job to more than what he had before is the same God who has been with you through every moment of what you endured and who is rebuilding you into more than what existed before. I want to speak now about the people around you who witnessed the attack and who drew their own conclusions from what they witnessed, because the comeback that God is releasing in your life is not going to be a private event. It is going to be witnessed by the same people who witnessed the attack. And what they witness is going to require them to update the conclusions they drew about your story during the season when things looked their worst. Some of them concluded that what they were witnessing was the permanent diminishment of a life that had failed to live up to its apparent potential. They watched the attack unfold, and they drew the narrative of a person who did not make it, who was not as special as they appeared to be, whose apparent promise was not backed up by the resilience that genuine promise requires, and they moved on from you with that narrative firmly in place. They are going to have to revise that narrative, because the comeback that God is releasing in your life is going to be undeniable. It is going to be so clearly the work of God, and so thoroughly beyond what could have been produced by human recovery and human resilience alone, that the narrative they constructed during the attack is going to be unsustainable in the face of what they are about to witness. And the revision of that narrative, the moment when they look at what God is doing in your life and have to acknowledge that what they concluded was wrong, is going to be one of the most powerful moments of testimony that your comeback produces. Some of them concluded that what was happening to you was evidence that God was not as reliable or as powerful or as specifically invested in the lives of His people as you had believed and as they had perhaps hoped. That if God genuinely loved you and genuinely had a plan for your life, He would not have allowed what the enemy sent, and so your attack became, in their processing of it, a kind of negative evidence about the character of God, a data point in the argument against trusting Him. What your comeback is going to do to those people is give them a data point in the other direction. It is going to be the evidence that God was present through every moment of the attack, and that He was working in the attack in ways that were invisible during it, but that are becoming visible in the aftermath. It is going to be the demonstration that the character of God is exactly what His Word declares it to be: faithful, sovereign, present, and entirely capable of using the worst things the enemy sends to produce the greatest demonstrations of His goodness. And some of the people who witnessed your attack and who drew their conclusions from it are going to be, through the witnessing of your comeback, drawn back to the God they had begun to doubt, or to the faith they had begun to release, or to the hope they had almost let go of, because what they saw happening to you made it feel too risky to hold on to. Your comeback is going to restore their hope. It is going to rebuild their faith. It is going to give them the evidence they needed to take the risk of trusting God again with the parts of their own life that they were protecting from the vulnerability of genuine trust. That is the ministry of your comeback. That is the purpose it serves beyond your own personal restoration. Every person who witnesses what God is doing in your life in this season is being given an opportunity to encounter the faithfulness of God through your story. And the encounters they have through your story are going to produce in some of them exactly what every genuine encounter with the faithfulness of God produces: the decision to trust, the decision to hope, the decision to believe that if God did this for them, He can do it for me too. Your comeback is bigger than your life. It always was, and the God who designed it knew that from the beginning. I want to speak now about what your responsibility is in the season of the comeback. Because the comeback that God is releasing is not a passive event that simply unfolds without any participation on your part. It is a collaboration between the sovereign activity of God and the faithful, active, obedient response of the person through whom He is working. And your part in it matters. The first thing your comeback requires of you is that you get up. Whatever state you are in right now, however depleted and however bruised and however tentative and uncertain you feel about what comes next, get up. Not because you have recovered everything that the attack took, not because the rebuilding is complete and you feel fully ready for what is coming, but because the God who is rebuilding you does not require the completion of the rebuilding before He asks you to begin moving in the direction of the comeback. He asks you to move while He is still building, to take the step while the foundation is still being laid, to put your weight on what is there even before everything that is coming is fully in place. The willingness to get up before you feel completely ready is one of the most significant acts of faith that the comeback season requires. Because the feeling of being completely ready almost never arrives before the first step. The first step is what produces the feeling. The movement is what activates the provision. The rising is what signals to heaven that you are ready to receive what God has been preparing to release. Get up. You have been down long enough, not because what you went through did not warrant the time on the ground. It did. The attack was real, and the damage was real, and the season of processing and healing, and the kind of quiet rebuilding that happens when you are not yet ready to be visible to the world, was necessary and was honored by God as the essential preparation that it was. But the season of being down is over, and the call of God over your life on this day is the same call that Jesus spoke over Lazarus at the entrance of the tomb. Come out. The season of the grave is finished. Rise. The season of the comeback has begun. The second thing your comeback requires is that you open your mouth, that you begin to declare what God is doing before it is fully visible, before every element of the comeback has fully manifested, before you have the completed testimony that makes the declaration feel fully warranted. Begin to declare it now, because the declaration of faith, the speaking of what God has promised before the evidence of the promise has fully arrived, is one of the most powerful forces in the process of the comeback. Proverbs 18:21 says that death and life are in the power of the tongue. And the application of that principle to the comeback season is specific and profound. The words you speak about your situation, about your future, about what God is doing and what He has promised and what is coming, those words are not neutral. They are not merely descriptive. They are creative. They participate in the shaping of the reality they describe, and the person who learns to speak the language of faith over their comeback, who declares the breakthrough before it is fully visible, and who affirms the faithfulness of God before the evidence of it has fully accumulated, is the person who creates through their words the spiritual atmosphere in which the comeback most fully and most powerfully manifests. The third thing your comeback requires is that you serve others while you are still in the process of your own recovery. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive element of the comeback, and the one that most people postpone until they feel more fully restored. Most people want to be in a place of more complete recovery before they make themselves available to serve the people around them. They want to wait until they have more to give, until they feel more adequate, until the rebuilding is more complete, and they feel more like the person they are going to be on the other side of the comeback, rather than the person who is still in the middle of it. But the testimony that is most powerful, and the ministry that is most genuine, comes not from the completely restored person looking back on the attack from a safe distance. It comes from the person who is still in the process of the comeback and who is choosing, from within that process, to make their experience and their faith and their gradually accumulating evidence of God's faithfulness available to the people around them who need it most. The ministry of the still being rebuilt person is not diminished by the incompleteness of the rebuilding. It is authenticated by it. It is given its specific and irreplaceable power by the fact that the person ministering is not speaking from theory, but from current, still in progress, real and costly personal experience. I want to speak about something that I believe is the most important truth of this entire message. And that truth is about the ultimate purpose of the comeback, not the personal dimension of it, not the restoration of your circumstances, or the healing of your wounds, or the advancement of your calling, or the vindication of your faith. The eternal, kingdom-advancing, glory-producing dimension of it. Father, I want to close this message with a prayer over every person who has received these words today. Lord, I pray for the one who came to this message still in the middle of the attack, who has not yet reached the other side, who is still in the fire, and who is struggling to maintain the faith that you are present and working in the middle of what they are enduring. Meet them, Lord, in the fire. Let them feel your presence in the place of their burning, the way Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego felt it. Not after the fire was over, in the middle of it. Let them know with a certainty that no argument can produce, and that only your presence can convey that you are with them in the fire, and that the fire is not going to consume what you have declared about their life. Lord, I pray for the one who has come through the attack and who is now in the rebuilding season, but who is struggling to believe that what is being rebuilt is going to be everything that the pre-attack version was and more. Speak into their uncertainty, Lord. Let them receive the truth that what you rebuild is always better than what the enemy destroyed, that your rebuilding is not restoration to baseline, but advancement to the fullness of what you always intended, and that the rebuilt version of their life is going to be the version that most completely and most powerfully fulfills the purpose you declared before the attack ever came. Lord, I pray for the one whose comeback is beginning to manifest and who is stepping into the visibility of it for the first time, who is stepping out of the hiddenness of the rebuilding season and into the public expression of what the rebuilding produced. Give them the grace to carry the elevation with the humility that preserves the fruit of the hidden seasons, the wisdom to steward the visibility in ways that consistently point people not to themselves, but to you, and the courage to let the story be told completely, including the worst parts, because it is in the fullness of the testimony that the greatest glory is produced. And Lord, I pray for all of them together as they step into the comeback that you have declared and that you are actively producing in their lives on this day. Go before them into every day of the season ahead. Open the doors that need to be opened. Close the doors that need to remain closed. Align the people and the resources and the circumstances that the fullness of the comeback requires, and let everything that the enemy meant for destruction become in your hands the material for the most extraordinary demonstration of your faithfulness that their story has ever produced. You are faithful, Lord. The enemy failed, and the rebuild that you are doing in the lives of the people who are receiving this word today is going to stand as the testimony of your faithfulness that echoes beyond their own generation and into the lives of every person whose faith is strengthened and whose hope is rebuilt by the encounter with the evidence of what you did. In the name of Jesus. Amen. And so, my dear friend, I close with this, a declaration that I want you to carry with you from this moment forward, through every day of the comeback season that is unfolding in your life. Through every moment when the evidence of the rebuild is more visible, and through every moment when it is less visible but still happening. Through every day when the breakthrough feels close, and through every day when it feels distant but approaching. Through every moment when the faith comes easily, and through every moment when it costs you everything to maintain it, carry this declaration, speak it out loud over your life. Let it be the defining truth through which you interpret everything that is happening and everything that is coming. The enemy failed. God is rebuilding me, and my comeback is not just coming, it is already underway. Every day that I am standing is evidence of the enemy's failure. Every day that I am moving forward is evidence of God's faithfulness. Every breath I draw is the testimony that what was sent to destroy me did not finish me. And what God is building in the aftermath of what the enemy sent is going to be more powerful and more fruitful and more completely aligned with the purpose God always had in mind than anything that existed before the attack. I am not the same person who entered the attack. I am better, deeper, more rooted, more free from what was never meant to hold me, more aligned with what God always intended, and I am ready for the fullness of the comeback that the God who has been faithful through everything is now releasing into every dimension of my life. The enemy failed. God is rebuilding me, and the best is absolutely still ahead.